If you believe love always wins, this story will break that belief, and rebuild it in the most unexpected way. On her wedding night, in front of guests who came to celebrate love, a groom leaned close to his bride and whispered words so cruel they echoed louder than vows, "I will never touch you again." What followed was not just humiliation, but a chain of secrets, revenge, buried truths, and a final twist no one saw coming. If you love emotional stories that start in pain and end in power, subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they stay with you. The hall was drenched in gold and white, chandeliers dripping light like molten glass, music swelling as if joy itself had been hired for the evening, yet inside Alia Khan everything felt hollow, her breath shallow beneath layers of embroidered fabric that weighed more than her own fear, because this wedding was not a dream fulfilled but a decision forced, agreed upon in quiet rooms by voices that were not hers, sealed by obligations she never chose, and as she stood at the center of the room beside a man she barely knew, smiling for cameras while her fingers trembled inside silk gloves, she understood with terrifying clarity that this day was not the beginning of her life but the end of something precious she would never recover. Zayn Malik, no relation to the singer, though people joked about it endlessly, stood tall beside her, impeccably dressed, respected, admired, a man with money, lineage, and influence, the kind of groom families bragged about securing, and yet when he looked at Alia there was no warmth, no curiosity, no softness, only restraint sharpened into disdain, as if her presence was an inconvenience he had agreed to tolerate for reasons far bigger than her existence. Their marriage had been arranged hastily after her father's business collapsed, after death swallowed pride, after whispered negotiations replaced dignity, and when the proposal came from Zayn's family it was framed as salvation, though Alia sensed it was closer to a transaction than mercy. She remembered the night she had tried to resist, her voice shaking as she told her mother she wasn't ready, that she wanted time, that she didn't love him, only to be met with exhausted eyes and trembling hands that held hers too tightly, her mother whispering that sometimes love was a luxury, that survival came first, that sacrifice was the duty of daughters like her, and in that moment Alia had folded, not because she agreed, but because she saw no other way to protect the people she loved. The ceremony progressed with rehearsed perfection, vows exchanged like lines memorized from a script neither of them believed in, applause filling the air while Alia's heart pounded so loudly she was sure the guests could hear it, and when the time came for photographs Zayn's hand rested at her waist like a warning rather than a promise, his fingers stiff, cold, deliberate, and she flinched so slightly that only he noticed, his jaw tightening as though her reaction offended him. It was during the final ritual, when guests leaned in closer, when laughter and chatter blurred into background noise, that Zayn bent his head toward hers, his lips brushing her ear as if to share something intimate, and in that second Alia foolishly hoped for reassurance, for kindness, for some acknowledgement that this nightmare might soften with time, but instead his voice was low, controlled, venomously calm as he said, "Do not misunderstand this marriage. I will never touch you again. This ends tonight." Her breath caught, her vision swam, and for a moment the world tilted, the hall spinning as though the floor itself had shifted beneath her feet, yet her face remained frozen in a smile trained by years of obedience. Because humiliation, she knew, was safest when swallowed whole. She didn't respond, didn't dare turn her head, because the cameras were still flashing, the guests still watching, unaware that a bride had just been sentenced to a loveless existence before the ink on her marriage certificate had even dried. Zayn straightened, his expression neutral once more, and to anyone watching they looked like a perfect couple, but inside Alia something fractured, a silent crack spreading through her chest, because his words were not merely rejection, they were erasure, a declaration that she would exist beside him only in name, a wife without affection, without dignity, without voice. Later, when the guests finally left and the doors to their new home closed behind them, the silence was suffocating, each footstep echoing through corridors too large, too cold, and when Alia hesitated at the threshold of the bedroom, heart racing, Zayn didn't even look at her as he removed his cufflinks, his back turned, his tone clinical as he said, "You will have your own room. We will appear together in public when necessary. Beyond that, do not expect anything from me." She wanted to ask why, wanted to scream that she had never wanted this either, that she had given up her life, her dreams, her love for the sake of survival, but the words lodged in her throat because something in his posture warned her that explanations were not welcome, and so she nodded, whispered, "Okay," and retreated down the hallway like a ghost, closing the door to her room gently as if loud sounds might shatter what little strength she had left. That night, alone in a bed meant for celebration, Alia cried silently into a pillow embroidered with their initials, unaware that this humiliation was only the first layer of a much darker truth, unaware that Zayn's cruelty was rooted in a secret that would one day destroy him, unaware that the marriage designed to break her would instead become the forge that reshaped her into something unstoppable. Because while he believed he had trapped her in silence, fate was already moving, quietly, patiently, toward a reckoning neither of them was prepared for. Morning arrived without warmth in the Malik estate, sunlight filtered through tall windows but never quite reaching Alia's room, as if even the day itself respected the distance imposed upon her, and she woke with swollen eyes, her body heavy from a night spent staring at the ceiling, replaying Zane's words again and again until they lost sound and became a constant ache. Because I will never touch you again was not just a sentence but a reminder that she had been accepted as a wife and rejected as a woman in the same breath. She rose quietly, dressed modestly, and stepped into the hallway where the house already moved around her with rehearsed efficiency, servants lowering their eyes, footsteps careful, everyone aware of the invisible line she was expected not to cross. At breakfast, Zane sat at the far end of a long table scrolling through his phone, his presence dominating the room despite his silence, and Alia took a seat only after being gestured to by his mother, Farah Malik, a woman whose elegance was sharpened by control, her smile polite but distant, as though Alia were a guest who had overstayed her welcome rather than a daughter-in-law. No one spoke of the wedding night, no one asked how she felt, and the omission itself felt like a confirmation that humiliation was now a permanent fixture of her life. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern never changed. Zane left early, returned late, interacted with her only in public settings where appearances mattered, his hand light on her arm for cameras, his voice polite but cold when others were listening, and the moment they were alone he withdrew completely, as though proximity itself disgusted him. Rumors began to circulate quietly among staff, whispers that the marriage was strange, incomplete, that the bride slept alone, that the groom avoided her like a stranger, and Alia absorbed it all in silence, learning quickly that dignity, when stripped publicly, could still be protected privately if one chose patience over despair. What she did not know was that Zane watched her too, from a distance he pretended did not exist, his eyes lingering when she laughed softly with the housekeeper, when she read alone in the garden, when she moved with a grace untouched by bitterness, and those moments unsettled him more than anger ever could, because they contradicted the image he had built of her long before the wedding, an image shaped not by truth, but by a memory that refused to loosen its grip on his conscience. Years earlier, before wealth had insulated him, before power had replaced vulnerability, Zane had loved a woman named Sarah, fiercely, recklessly, with the blind certainty of youth, and Sarah had vanished from his life the same night his family's oldest business partner had been arrested for fraud, a scandal that destroyed reputations, led to a suicide rumor that was never confirmed, and left Zane's father with blood on his hands that money could not wash away. Sarah disappeared without explanation, leaving behind nothing but a final unanswered call, and in the aftermath Zane learned that her father was the man who had taken the fall for crimes orchestrated by the Malik Empire. The guilt rotted slowly, turning into resentment, then into a belief that people like Alia, people tied to debt, desperation, and sacrifice, were reminders of sins he could never undo. When his mother proposed the marriage, explaining that Alia's father's company was once connected to that same disgraced partner, Zane felt something snap inside him, a cruel symmetry he mistook for justice, and he agreed not because he wanted a wife, but because he wanted control, distance, punishment without admitting it was punishment at all. What Zane did not expect was the discovery that unraveled everything. One evening, weeks into the marriage, Alia was organizing old files in the study at Farah Malik's request when she found a folder marked with a familiar name, Imran Khan, her father. Her hands shook as she opened it, pages revealing contracts, signatures, dates that didn't align with the story she had grown up believing, documents suggesting her father had tried to stop the fraud years ago, had warned authorities anonymously, had lost everything not because he was guilty, but because he refused to participate. Her breath caught as she realized the truth. Her family had been collateral damage, not accomplices. Zane entered the room unexpectedly and froze when he saw the file open in her hands, his face draining of color, anger flaring instantly as he demanded to know what she was doing, but Alia didn't flinch this time, her voice quiet yet steady as she asked, "Did you know my father tried to stop it? Did you know he lost everything because he wouldn't cooperate?" Silence swallowed the room, thick and suffocating, because Zane did know, or at least, he had suspected, and in that moment the foundation of his cruelty cracked, guilt flooding in with terrifying force, because the woman he had humiliated, rejected, and emotionally exiled was not the symbol of his pain but another victim of the same betrayal that had shaped his life. He said nothing, turned away sharply, leaving the room without explanation, but the damage was done, because Alia had seen it, the hesitation, the fracture, the truth bleeding through his control. From that night onward, something shifted. Zane's hostility softened into distance tinged with unease. his avoidance no longer confident but defensive, while Alia began to understand that her suffering was not random, that it had roots, that knowledge itself was power. She didn't confront him again, didn't demand apologies, because she realized something far more important. He was afraid, not of her anger, but of the truth she now held. And quietly, without rage, without rebellion, Alia began to change. She educated herself on the Malik Empire, learned the names behind the money, listened carefully in rooms where she was underestimated, built alliances with kindness rather than ambition, and with each step she reclaimed something Zayn had tried to erase. She no longer cried at night. She no longer flinched when he entered a room. And though he still told himself he would never touch her again, he began to understand with growing dread that he was the one losing control, because the woman he believed he had broken was slowly, patiently, preparing for a moment that would redefine both of them. And when that moment came, the humiliation would no longer belong to her. The night everything unraveled arrived quietly, disguised as celebration, because the Malik Empire was hosting its most important annual gala, a glittering event attended by investors, politicians, journalists, and rivals who smiled through teeth sharpened by ambition, and Alia stood beside Zayn at the top of the marble staircase as flashes erupted like fireworks, her posture calm, her expression composed, every inch the elegant wife everyone assumed she had become naturally, not realizing that this calm had been carved from months of silence, observation, and restraint. Zayn adjusted his cufflinks, his jaw tight, because for weeks now he had sensed something shifting beyond his control, subtle changes in how people looked at Alia, how executives listened when she spoke, how his mother had begun asking her opinion instead of issuing instructions, and though he told himself it meant nothing, unease had settled into his chest like a warning he refused to acknowledge. The evening unfolded smoothly at first, speeches delivered, champagne poured, laughter echoing beneath chandeliers, and when Farah Malik announced that Alia would say a few words about the foundation the family supported, Zayn stiffened, turning toward her with a sharp whisper asking what she was doing, but Alia only smiled, her eyes meeting his briefly with a calm that unsettled him more than anger ever could. She stepped forward to the podium, her voice steady as she spoke about resilience, about families destroyed by corruption they never consented to, about the quiet strength of people who lose everything and still refuse to become bitter, and the room listened, not politely, but intently, because there was something undeniable in her presence, something earned rather than inherited. Then she shifted, gently, deliberately, naming her father, Imran Khan, thanking him publicly for teaching her integrity even when it cost everything, and the room stirred as journalists glanced up sharply, recognition sparking as fragments of old scandals resurfaced in collective memory. Alia continued, revealing documents already submitted to authorities, evidence long buried that proved her father's attempt to expose the fraud years ago, evidence that also implicated senior figures in the Malik Empire, not Zayn directly, but close enough to unravel reputations built on silence. She did not accuse. She did not shout. She simply told the truth, calmly, clearly, with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Zayn felt the room closing and as murmurs grew louder, faces turning toward him with curiosity sharpened by suspicion, and in that moment he understood the full weight of his cruelty, because the woman he had humiliated on their wedding night was now standing unshaken beneath a storm he could neither stop nor escape. His mother's face paled, control slipping for the first time as whispers spread faster than any public relations team could contain, and when the speech ended the applause was hesitant, fractured, uncertain, but it was there, because truth, once spoken aloud, demands acknowledgement. Later, in the quiet of their home, Zayn confronted Alia in the study where everything had begun, his voice strained, anger and desperation tangled together as he demanded why she had done it publicly, why she hadn't warned him, why she had chosen tonight of all nights, and Alia listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, until he finally ran out of words and silence fell between them like a verdict. When she spoke, her voice was neither cruel nor triumphant, only honest as she said she had warned him the night she found the file, that he had chosen silence over accountability, and that she had spent months learning the cost of obedience. You told me on our wedding night you would never touch me again, she continued quietly, meeting his eyes without fear, and you were right. Because what you took from me wasn't my body. It was my voice. And I decided I wanted it back. The weight of her words crushed something inside him, because in that moment Zayn saw himself clearly, not as a victim of past betrayal, but as a man who had passed his pain forward, who had mistaken control for healing, punishment for justice. He apologized then, finally, not with rehearsed words or defensive explanations, but with visible fracture, admitting his fear, his guilt, his misplaced hatred, admitting that he had used her marriage as a shield against confronting his own complicity. But apologies, Alia had learned, did not rewind time. She told him she would not expose him further, that she had no interest in revenge, only in truth, and that the Foundation would now operate independently under her leadership, using Malik resources transparently or not at all. She offered him a choice, not as a wife begging for validation, but as an equal: stand beside her publicly and accept the consequences, or step away and let the world draw its own conclusions. Days later, headlines exploded, investigations reopened, alliances shifted, and the Malik empire was forced to change or collapse beneath scrutiny it could no longer outrun. Zayn chose to stand beside her, resigned from positions of unchecked authority, and for the first time in his life allowed himself to be seen as flawed rather than powerful. Their marriage did not transform overnight into romance, because wounds like theirs demanded time, honesty, and humility, but something new emerged: respect, earned rather than assumed. Months later, as they stood together at a quieter event, no cameras screaming, no audience waiting for spectacle, Zayn reached for her hand hesitantly, pausing as if giving her the power to decide what came next, and Alia looked at him for a long moment before allowing their fingers to intertwine, not as forgiveness granted automatically but as possibility earned through accountability. She leaned close then, her voice calm, steady, unmistakably strong as she whispered back the words that had once broken her, now stripped of their cruelty and returned with truth and tact. "I will never let you erase me again." And this time, those words didn't end something. They began it.